Hi everybody, my name is Ben Poston with the LA Times. I'm a data reporter there. I'm going to, can you make it so the lights are just a little bit dimmer in the front? I'm just going to give an overview of some of the stories that I've worked on at the LA Times that are going to hopefully demonstrate. I think I'm going to talk more today about mapping data. But with mapping data comes data analysis, spreadsheets, database managers, mapping, and then I think I'm going to also talk about a story where you build your own database and then how that works and how you can build your own database from paper records and then how you would do an analysis on that. So I'm going to start with. I know it talked about street quality, which we can also do, but I'm just going to start with this one, which story we did last year. Again, I'm on the data team at the LA Times. We also have a graphics desk, and a member of our graphics team, John Schlois, worked with me, and I really hope this plays because the internet's a little slow. Let's give it a shot.
Every day, dozens of residents ask the city of Los Angeles to pick up illegally dumped waste from their alleyways and sidewalks. Since 2010, sanitation crews failed to close more than 20% of those requests, which officials said was due to a lack of resources and failures in data tracking. But a Los Angeles Times analysis found that the lack of service was concentrated in Central, Northeast, and South LA.
That's a really quick overview of the story that we did. And I want to freeze frame it if I can. It's probably not going to let me. Okay, but I want you to, if you can remember that image of, and I'll pull up another map here in a second. If you remember that image of South LA, East LA, and kind of Northeast LA. And I'll pull up another map just so we can look. So I got, what started that story was Mayor Eric Garcetti came in and he pitched himself as the Back to Basics mayor. So what matters to him, how he's going to be like judged is basic city services. So it's street repaving, it's picking up illegally dumped trash, it's doing graffiti removal, bulky item pickup, all that kind of stuff. And when I looked, so we decided, I was working with the City Hall reporter at the time, Peter Jameson, and we said like let's actually like I think at that point we were a little over 2 years into Garcetti's tenure. And let's actually get the data from the city so we can judge how well he's doing, how well the city's doing under him. And of course, the internet is just not going to work right now, but I'll just keep talking while it loads. So we get this data, this illegal dumping data, and it, usually when you get data and you map it, you're looking at it, it's interesting, you're trying to find trends in the actual map. This one had this really stark disparity, right? So that those areas that the video showed were getting like no service whatsoever. So, or I take that back. They were getting a small percentage of their stuff was being picked up compared to the rest of the city, which was like the Valley, the West Side, and kind of where we are, where like 99% of requests were being picked up. So it's just rare that you get this like crazy geographic disparity. So it raised a lot of questions, and we went to city sanitation and talked to them. And as a data journalist, the first level is you get the data, you map it, you see this thing, and you're like, the first thing that happens is you get really excited. Just like, I have a great story. These people in those areas, especially South LA and East LA, are getting, they're really getting screwed. And if you know anything about the city, those are the areas that have higher rates of poor people, lower income people. So, so we're just going like, oh man, like this could be bad for the mayor and for the city. But in my head, I'm playing like devil's advocate, and I'm always, when I get data like this and I find something, the rule of thumb is if it seems like it's too good to be true, it probably is. So I spend a lot of time as a data journalist. I start with a theory or a research question. I get some data that's going to try to answer that question, and then once I think I have an answer and I think it's a good story for journalistically, I'm going to then try to disprove my own story. So my mind immediately goes to, well, it's cool that you found this crazy disparity, but is that reality? Is that really happening? Or did you just get data? Oh, it finally loaded. Okay, those will just take a little bit longer to load because the internet's so slow. But is what you're seeing, is it just bad data, right? Is the data that you got just inaccurate? And because the data we were looking at was like, did these illegal dumping requests, did they get picked up? And a lot of the ones I was looking at were just blank. So I'm thinking, oh, was it just a record keeping problem that they just didn't enter picked up on this date for these requests? But then I'm thinking, why would it only be misrecorded in these areas and not the rest of the city? So I spent so basically that was the beginning level question with the city was, is this data accurate? And they're like, yeah, it is accurate. And then we're like, okay, well, this is bad. So then we met with them, we talked about it, we did our story. Hopefully that will load someday. And we wrote this story, which you saw the video to. And, these are some of our findings. The Mayor Garcetti, the day before we published, he called for an investigation into the city sanitation department. Into why this was happening, why these big disparities were happening. There was this backlog of, I can't remember how many thousand requests. There was this backlog that they never went, completed or picked up. They cleared over the next couple months. They cleared the backlog, and when the sanitation director went in front of the committee, he basically said what happened was during tight budget times after the recession, they had limited resources, so they would go out to like alleys in South LA, and the alleys would have bags of trash, they would have tires, they would have dumped TVs, and they'd have bulky items. Well, the budget only really allowed them to pick up the bulky items and sometimes the tires, but everything else was like too much for their trucks, and they wouldn't pick it up. So they would actually go and pick up the couches and the chairs, but then they would leave the mound of all the other stuff. And he said that the requests in South LA were just the volume of trash in these alleys and some of these streets was just so great that they just were like, we can't do anything with it. I'm like, I've been to parts of the valley, and like there's some stuff up there that's also pretty bad, but for some reason they could get 99% of those. So, they did this, and then following this, because the internet's so bad I won't show, they now have a thing called Clean Streets, where they actually drive around and inspect every street for cleanliness, and they look at illegal dumping, bulky items, graffiti, homeless encampments, and like one other thing. So now they systematically go around the city, record the data on how clean or dirty it is, put that into a database, and then that gets mapped. And we did a story on that. So that's sort of like and New York City's been doing that for like 30 years, and LA just did it this year. So LA in a lot of ways is catching up to New York on the data side, and on if anybody's like familiar with policing, CompStat is just like a way to it's an accountability measure that you track things with a computer database. So that's a story where mapping data, simple like service request data, leads to finding this big disparity, which leads to the mayor calling for an investigation and asking the department to clean it up.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Where did you get the data to start with?
Absolutely, great question. We got the data from the city, it's the Department of Public Works, and which they oversee the Bureau of Sanitation. So and this is just basically when you pick up the phone or go online and do a 311 request, this is the data that we got. That's the data we got. It's just data request, the nature of the complaint, illegal dumping bulky item. It was filed on this day. When was it completed? And what's the location of it? And sometimes, and a lot of times, it would have a description like bags of trash, couches, whatever. So that's one example of mapping. Let's see, and then we did a follow story, which of course these maps will not load. I'll try it one more time. But we also mapped potholes, bulky item requests, and graffiti, and we found different patterns across the city. Any other questions on that while I bring up the next story?
So how did the data come to you, like in an Excel spreadsheet form? Or?
It did. It came as Excel. Yeah, it came as Excel, and the data was pretty clean, except for the fact that it was all these records were blank, the ones that they didn't complete. But yeah, it came pretty clean, and it had latitude, longitude data, like XY data, so we could actually, instead of having to, it's a lot of requests, instead of having to like run it through a geocoder to take an address and convert it to a latitude, longitude point, it was already there, so we could just, it was easy data to work with because when you have latitude, longitude, you can just bring that in. If anybody's used Google Fusion or CartoDB or QGIS or ArcMap, if you have data that already has those lat long points, you can easily bring that in and display that in mapping software. Let's see. Yay! Okay, so these maps do exist. So we did the illegal dumping story, and then as part of the story, like, well, let's get everything we can get on service requests in the city, right? So this was the second story, which sort of dovetailed, and we have potholes, bulky item, and graffiti. So, okay, you're now the data journalist. You've got this data. You've mapped this data. What sort of trends do you see as you look at these maps? And they're all on slightly different scales. Far left is median number of days, or the left and right are median number of days, and the one in the middle is percent picked up by next election day, which is a different metric. So we see any interesting things we might want to write about or ask questions about? We start really with the questions.
I think it's sort of interesting, and I'm not really sure what it means, but that the trash and the graffiti, obviously it's much slower to respond in the really poor sections of the city.
Mm-hmm.
But the potholes, so Brentwood is not doing a whole lot better than some of the bad sections of town.
Yeah.
Why is that? That's sort of like weird. And Santa
Yeah, right.
Monica and Venice.
Yeah, so the other story that I think got pitched was the street quality thing, which I can show. But you're exactly right. It's interesting. This is what when we map data. This is the sort of stuff we look for. Is this pattern? See this?
Mm-hmm.
So this is that's Griffith Park, Hollywood Hills West, Bel Air, Studio City, I believe. That's Hollywood. So what do we know about this region of LA?
High traffic?
Hollywood definitely high traffic. But when we think about like Hollywood Hills, Bel Air, it's wealthy, but it's also think about as it relates to potholes.
It's hard to get to.
It's hard to get to.
High up in the hill.
So it's hilly, and also those streets. When I show you the other story, the streets in the hills are terrible. They're really bad, and they're getting worse, and they're not fixing them. So you have bad streets combined with the fact that they're hilly and they're hard to get to. And So you have Hollywood Hills West right here, which I don't know if I can. I don't think this is not. Oh yeah, it is interactive. So Hollywood Hills West. 30 days, a median time of 30 days to fix, which I believe we used in the story as a contrasting point. So it takes 30 days, and I believe Atwater Village took like, or some other place took like 3, or no, it was Chinatown, because I just looked at this. Downtown and Chinatown. So Chinatown was 4 days, 4.5 days, and it took almost a month in Hollywood Hills West. So you start to see these disparities, and you can write about them. And it's interesting because oftentimes the most interesting stuff is the stuff that's counterintuitive, right? You wouldn't think that if I live in the hoity-toity area of Hollywood Hills West with the stars, that I would get the worst service in the city. So we called the neighborhood council person up there, and she's like, same thing with street potholes. The streets are bad, the potholes are bad. When the water pipes are always breaking, because you have this high pressurized system as they move the water up the hills, and they're also really old and decrepit up there because that's the old part of the city. So it's this thing where you wouldn't expect it to be bad there, but it actually is. So that's potholes. So potholes kind of tracks with geography, with some exceptions down here in South LA. And then what about bulky items? So bulky items are couches, chairs, mattresses, box springs that people put out. You actually put it out on the curb and say, come pick it up, and they have a week. What do we see? What kind of jumps out at you here?
They don't go to San Pedro.
Yeah, they don't. Something's going on down here in San Pedro and Wilmington and this part of the city that a lot of people forget even exists. But it's crazy. You have 60-some% of, I don't know if San Pedro, 62% were picked up after that 1 week period, whereas you have all this stuff where we're at, it was all picked up 4%, So there's something going on here. So this is its own sanitation district. So there's something going on with that sanitation district that they're obviously not cutting the muster. And then graffiti. What do we see in graffiti? What sort of interesting little thing do we see there? Remember that the darker the area, the longer it took them to respond.
Is that back to South Central?
That kind of is. Are you referring to this?
The dark, yeah.
Right there? Yeah. So that is. Yeah, and here I'll mouse over. That's downtown. I think we're right here. So this is sort of like West Adamsy. Let's mouse over some of the neighborhoods. Jefferson Park, Mid-City, West Adams, Baldwin Hills Crenshaw, Limerick. So you don't know this because you probably haven't spent any time thinking about graffiti removal, as much time as I have, but the city contracts out graffiti removal to subcontractors. So this area is all covered by one contractor, and it's the LA Conservation Corps, which is actually a pretty well-known one. But something's going on. No, you have to remember though that it's only 3. Let's mouse over one of them. It's only the median wait time on graffiti is really fast, right? 3 days. So the difference between potholes, 30 versus 4.5, 5. I mean, it's a factor of 6. Whereas this is a it's a tighter group data set where everything kind of falls within 0 to 4 days. So they're doing worse, but they're not doing terrible. But we definitely wrote about this and asked some questions about what's going on with the LA Conservation Corps. Why can't they do as well as because the east side of LA has a lot. There's still a lot of gangs there, and there's a lot of graffiti, and so these are the sort of things. It's kind of fun. It's fun to map. It's fun to find disparities, to look for trends, and it's also fun to kind of put them up together, and you can kind of see differences. So kind of what we wrote about with this story was, and remember that the trend on the illegal dumping was basically all of this got really bad service, and everything else was perfect. So when we wrote it up, I mean, this is kind of the hard part. You you get the data, you do the analysis, you do the mapping. I think the hardest part of data journalism is getting it from analysis to findings to story form. Writing it in like a way that's interesting, that people can digest, that's not overwhelming to the reader. You know, you don't want to hit them with too many numbers. You want to really connect the dots and make it easy to understand. And you want to let the graphics, you know, the maps and the graphics carry the load. The way we wrote this up was, you know, it was 1.5 million records. You know, it depends on where you live. Basically, the level of service you get in the city depends on where you live. That's kind of the top line finding. Here's our disparities. City crews took 4 weeks to fill potholes in Hollywood Hills West, but just 4.5 days in Chinatown. Talked about that one. Bulky items, West LA, bulky items, 97% of the time. Wilmington, less than 40. And then mid-Wilshire, you have your graffiti disparity. And then we kind of, we reference the previous story. And then this is kind of what we in journalism call, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, the nut graph. You know, unlike illegal dumping, the city's response to complaints did not track a neighborhood's wealth. The wide variations in service levels underscored the challenges of ensuring consistency in basic functions of this giant city. And then we have Garcetti making excuses about in a city this big, it's going to really be tough to find changes happen. I liked this was the quote that I think was in the headline. The city just has a bunch of inequity baked in. So Marquise came from South LA, and this has always been the issue. One of the issues in South LA is that we get worse service. And he was really, when he saw the illegal dumping stuff, he was like, "This is the thing that I basically campaigned on." Bunch of inequity baked in. The city has a lot has been accepted that this is just the way it is. So you had people down in South LA like go on like 311 campaigns where they're like, everybody submit your requests, because now they say that they're aware of this, and then they're going to really respond to requests. So let's really submit. We have to really submit requests, and also stay on top of them. The one thing you'll hear people say is like, why do certain areas get service and others don't? I think, you know, it's a city, it's a government bureaucracy. Like, just calling or submitting a request isn't always going to get it. You have to sometimes follow up. Sometimes you have to call your council member to put some pressure. So I think it's like, some people are like, well, people just put a request in and they just assume the city's going to do it. And whereas in other neighborhoods, maybe like West Side neighborhoods are a little bit more involved, and they are willing to pick up the phone and harass their council member. So that gets to some of the things of like, why is this happening? Any questions on those stories? Yes.
What kind of reaction did you get from readers?
Yeah, from readers. I mean, we just got a lot of like, you know, thanks for bringing attention to this. Like in the South LA example, like they had a little rally to like generate like support, like generate 311 requests. It was just like, do more of it. Like, please do more of this. You know, like bring more attention to this. And then obviously the reaction on the city, like the mayor's, the investigation the mayor called for. Yeah.
Do you guys
Yes, I want to add to the issues of graffiti removal.
Uh-huh.
Because I observed it's like pushing wave back the ocean.
Right.
Because I observed in a western area,
Uh-huh.
I saw them clean up the graffiti. About 2 days later, graffiti's back.
Yeah.
So what's
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, we were, I won't play the video, but the people, the women that were in the video from LA Conservation Corps, they would go paint over the same place, the same exact spot every day, like literally every day.
yeah, I saw it.
They would go back and it would just be the same wall and they would paint over it. They come back the next day, paint over it. You know, I think it's just, you're always going to have those spots, especially if it's near like a gang, you know, area. I think it's just, you know, the city has money to do this, and they, you know, I think if you do it long enough, if you continue to do it, paint over it, some areas will improve. but you're probably just moving the problem around. I don't know. I mean, it's a great question, because it's not every area is like that, I guess would be my answer. Some areas you actually paint over and it will just, they'll stop. And it also, with the gang stuff, it kind of comes and goes with gang conflicts. And if somebody gets killed and then somebody spray paints their name and then it gets spray painted over, then that can be a problem. I want to talk about, I could talk about mapping all day, and I think mapping is, for people who are like getting into it, getting into data journalism, I think mapping is a really fun way in. And I will just show this map. I'm not going to spend, because I only have like 20 more minutes, but just another mapping example. I did a story 3 years ago, and we came back at it this summer, and I'll just show you this map. The story is basically the city has it's like 70,000 street segments. It's the largest street network in the country for a municipal network. It's got something like, I can't even remember the number now, 7,000 lane miles. And basically their strategy is, with a limited budget, their strategy is preserve the streets that are graded A, B, and C, and anything that's graded D and F is largely just forgotten about, because it's so expensive to fix those. So their goal is, if we can keep those, especially those C's, if we can keep them at C or better, it's just more cost effective. So this will populate in a second. So it's sort of a, it's a little counterintuitive at first, but then I guess it makes sense. So those streets graded D and F, which will pop up in my lifetime, hopefully, have just gotten worse, and the A, B, and C streets have stayed the same or gotten better. So when you map it, what I found was the San Fernando Valley, which was 3 years ago, like right before Garcetti came into office, was already at a pretty high level compared to the rest of the city. It got better. So it was already pretty good in this high C range, and it all got better, whereas these areas like Silver Lake and Mount Washington, which were among the worst, just continue to get worse. And the reason for that is that they have the streets in Silver Lake and Mount Washington, those older neighborhoods, also Echo Park, are all concrete streets. They're hard concrete, and they basically have no budget to replace those because they're so expensive. Because you got to jackhammer them, completely remove them, do a new road foundation, and then repave. And so that was kind of the main finding of the story. And it was just one where we had older data and we compared it to new data, and we saw change over time. A lot of times when you map, you'll see people map data, it'll just be a snapshot, which is all that previous stuff was just a snapshot. Here we go. So let's put our data journalism hats back on. What do we see here? Do we see any sort of geographic trend as we look at this level that I kind of hinted at earlier? I'll zoom in one click here. We see any sort of trend? Oh yeah, the key. So the pink is F. Who? Yeah. So A and B are green, and then the pinker it is, the worse it gets. So I think you said it. I mean, you're seeing this area, right? So, right. And especially over in here. So, again, those are the Hollywood Hills. This is all the hillside communities. This is Los Feliz. This is Silver Lake. This is Mount Washington. and again, the story found that like, if you looked at this data 3 years ago, it was bad, and then it really has in these areas. Like, let's zoom in on Silver Lake, which is basically this. There's the Silver Lake Reservoir right there. I mean, every street's an F. I mean, almost every street's an F, and then you can mouse over, and you can see that it was a 12 out of. This is a score of 0 to 100. It was a 12, and now it's a 6.
And the high score being
100. 0 to 100.
wow.
So it was an F and it stayed an F. So you see all these streets that basically over here just continue to get worse. Yes?
Sorry, I may have missed this. 2 questions. One, is this mapping the change, like it lifts,
Great question.
or is it mapping the current state?
This is just, this is the current state.
Okay, so.
This is a snapshot of current, but then but the tooltip gives you the change.
Okay, so like if something had been repaired and was added now today,
It's going to look like an A.
Okay. And then I'm just surprised based on what you said earlier, the Fancy Pants West Side over in Santa Monica also looks scrappy?
Yeah, let's zoom out. Where were you thinking? Like,
Monica over there?
so Santa Monica's outside the
Oh,
city.
Santa
It
Monica.
just doesn't have any data. But yeah, I mean, Venice actually isn't great. Venice did get better. Yeah, so Santa Monica is its own city, so it falls outside of city of LA. This is just city of LA.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are the people who completely, so I lived in Mount Washington, it's terrible, I can vouch for that. Are the people who completely replace streets a different organization than the people who maintain streets?
No, it's the same. It's a Bureau of Streets. Yeah, it's the same people. So so the cool thing, I just zoomed in on Silver Lake, and then Mount Washington was also really bad, which is right in here. And if you've been there, it's very hilly. The areas of the bad streets tend to be hillier, and then they have these old concrete streets. And Mount Washington especially is bad. So cool thing about data is when you have it and you're going to do a story using it, you don't have to sit there and go, man, how do I find a good anecdote? You let the data, you have this entire spreadsheet of 70,000 rows, and you just can, you can map it, which is the best way to do it. And when you do that and you go, wow, I guess I'll just drive around this area and I'll knock on some doors. And that's literally what we did. We just, and that's what I did for the first story. I think for the second story, we actually called somebody on the neighborhood council, and he was like, I live on this street. And then I looked it up and said, aha, of course it's a failed street. Let's go talk to him. But the data and the mapping gives you a roadmap, no pun intended, to go exactly where you need to go and just knock on some doors, get some anecdotes. So you don't have to sort of it's just right there for you. You have the whole universe at your fingertips when you want to go out and do your reporting. And I think in data journalism, the mix of, I have to do this overline analysis. I have to get the whole database. I have to clean it, get it ready to be analyzed, do my thing, have my big picture story, but I also have to drill down on the anecdotal and which we did in the story. So I think it's and I'm going to talk about this in the next one. It's the bouncing back and forth between that 10,000 foot view and then that ground view, and you need both. And you can't just do the big view. You need something. You need interesting anecdotes to kind of take the reader through. But if we just had anecdotes, that's what we had before data journalism, was just a bunch of anecdotes. And a bunch of people going, gee, I wonder, that's interesting. The old joke used to be 1, 2, 3 trend. You have three anecdotes makes a trend, and that's enough for an editor, and we're good to go. That's not the way it is anymore. That still happens, but we are always aspiring to. You hear a couple anecdotes and you go, I wonder if this is really a thing that's going on. Let's go get data from the Census Bureau, from the FEC, from the Elections Commission. Let's go see if this holds up, stands up to scrutiny on the actual data level. Any questions on? Yeah, then we have our little tool, I like that he added that. little guiding thing. And then, you know, with the change over time, one thing we did find was like these areas got worse, but like the one really counterintuitive area was Hancock Park, which still looks bad, but it actually improved a lot. It was even worse. Like all these streets over here got repaved. Like Highland got repaved. It was actually mostly major streets. Anyway, so let me just quickly, while I have time, is talk about a story that we did where we built our own database from paper records, because this happens a lot, and I think this is sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, because government data is great, and you know you can a lot more now. You can just download data from a government website, right? This LA County, LA City, the state has a GIS site where you can download information. That's great. And I think we should use that data. And I think sometimes it's not useful, but there is a lot of value to it. It's not, you know, but a lot of times we have to put in a records request to get good data, and that's usually what I do, put in records requests. But sometimes you can't, you know, none of that stuff's going to be publicly available, which is what happened in this case. Former reporter Robert Federecci, who covered the LA County Sheriff's Department, got through some sources a leak of data documents on some thumb drives. And he got it in 2012. He didn't know what to do with it. He had hundreds of Word document files, actually WordPerfect files, for those who remember what WordPerfect was, this horrible pre-Word thing. So we had hundreds of Word documents. We had folders with documents, audio, and photos. And the audio was the actual background files, like the polygraph exams of these people who were applying to the Sheriff's Department, and their whole background files. So we had people who were applying, they had worked at this other county police agency, which was being disbanded, and then they were applying to the Sheriff's Department. So we have them admitting to stuff that's like no one knew, you know, where they're admitting to like weird sex stuff and crimes that like even their families didn't know about. So we had like this really cool, you know, cache of records. So with Robert, he didn't know. He's like, well, I don't know how to make sense out of this. So we built a database. So we basically, and we don't explain how we built the database in here, but we built using Python and Django. We built a little like a web form, like an internal web form where you just you just open up your browser. It's got a thing that says like person A, you know, deputy A. His name's Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson. His name's Gary Miller, and he's this. You know, how old is he? How many previous law enforcement agencies did he work for? Was he ever arrested? Was he ever convicted? Did he ever admit to doing illegal sex? Did he ever admit to it? Was he ever convicted of it? Was he ever like fired from a previous law enforcement agency? So like 100 different fields we would fill out. Mostly drop down, like numerical and drop down fields, and then occasionally we would have notes fields. So you do that, and it's a way to systematically build a database so that it's consistent. So the fields are consistent, so you don't, because if you just have a spreadsheet and you have a couple reporters going in and you don't have standards, then people will put in different, you know, everybody will enter it a little different, and then you have to clean up a lot of the back end. Whereas if you have a web form, you can have a lot of continuity and just, you know, structure, right? So we used that. We built this database. We had to go through it a bunch of times. We had to fact check it. These were kind of our over-the-line numbers. You know, 400 applied, 280 were hired. You know, I mean, you know, 2/3 of them had been rejected previously before getting hired by the Sheriff's Department. Almost 100, you know, had lied or falsified records. Almost 100 had been disciplined. 30 had been fired or forced to resign previously. So basically, these are a lot of bad people, and I think they felt pressured to hire them because they were county employees. And so the story is kind of like a hard news story. And then we embedded audio, and I think here too, I'm going to play a couple of these clips. This is R-rated material, so I hope everybody's okay with that. But we found some pretty bad stuff. 280 were hired. People accidentally fired their service weapons, had sex at work, solicited prostitutes. So here's somebody who had sex at work.
Was a woman I was dating at the time. We were supposed to meet and go somewhere after work. She met me earlier, before my assignment was over, and we were talking, we started kissing, and we ended having sexual relations.
And this was on duty?
This was on duty, yes.
Were you in uniform?
I was in uniform.
And where were you when you had the sex?
I was in a dark area of the parking lot at Los Perdinos Juvenile Hall.
You were standing or on the floor?
Yeah.
Standing.
In between cars?
Yes.
Were either of you naked?
No.
So this is a guy, as an officer, it was called the Office of Public Safety. It was a county agency. While employed there, had sex on duty outside of a children's home, between two parked cars. So that's great. They hired him. And then here's a guy who's just, it's just, as a journalist, he's like my favorite person in the world. As a member of society, it's the exact opposite. It's just, you get into this weird place where you want people to talk to you. So David MacDonald, he was actually a twofer for us because he did some illegal sex stuff, and he talked about, his photo's not coming up, but he also did some stuff with inmate abuse in the jails and kind of talking about that. So he had a relationship when he was 28. He had a relationship with a 14-year-old girl, and when we went to his house, he said, I was in love, I wasn't being a bad guy. And then, we knock on his door, he says it, and it's like, no, you can't say that. You say, no comment. You say, get the hell out of here. You don't say, I was in love with a 14-year-old girl. And he was late. He was demoted after the story.
We never had intercourse, but we just made out, hugging and kissing kind of things. Yeah. We went out on two actual dates. One was in Alpine Village, and one was to the mall, South Bay Mall.
So you never have actual physical intercourse. Well, what about oral copulation?
No.
Any touching of the vagina or her touching your penis or anything like that?
Just groping, hugging and kissing. Cause we were just starting to date and stuff.
So that's David MacDonald, and then I'm going to play one more. We initially were going to do an interactive database of everybody we looked at, which would have been 280 people. I think just under 200 of those people had something in their record that was of interest. Not all really terrible stuff, but something. We ended up paring it down to just 20 people who were kind of the worst of the worst. So we had a little interactive database there. Here's one more guy, Ferdinand Salgado. Also kind of a double twofer. He did countermeasures, which basically means he tried to control his breathing during the polygraph to beat it. So that happened a lot, where people, it's a technique that people do. So that gets you evidence of dishonesty, because he's trying to not tip off the polygraph. And then also, as a county police officer, he had gotten off work and was arrested for soliciting a prostitute at a Yum Yum Donuts in Almonte. According to authorities, he had grinned at her, and then during his interview, he denied he said anything to the woman. So here's the little clip from that.
You're telling me that you went through the drive-thru or went to get some King Taco, she came up to you, didn't say one word to her, and you pull away and you get pulled over and arrested on top of that? Come on. They wouldn't have done that. I know. I've been there. I worked the streets. I've spent in that street, Darby Avenue. I know how it goes. They're not going to arrest you because you kept your mouth shut and drove away. They've got plenty of fish to catch. And you're going to sit there and tell me that you did not say one word to that lady? I ain't buying it. One cop to another. And you're not telling me the truth on that. Because if you were a patrol officer, you wouldn't chance your career and lie and say he said how much for a blowjob or how much for sex. It ain't worth it for a misdemeanor? Come on. You kidding me?
So, and I know we don't have out of her, but I just love Linda. She did answer the door, but she didn't talk to us. She basically got into a fight with her husband back in the 80s, and pulled out her service weapon and shot at him as he was running away. And the great quote from that was, he was lucky he was running in a zigzag pattern, because if not, the result would have been, quote, a whole lot different. Got hired as a jail guard. One thing we did find is, I mean, at the time, it's not good, but I mean, the only thing you can say is that the really bad ones, they didn't hire as deputies, so they're not out there pulling you over and arresting you. But a lot of them ended up in the jails, and if those of us who know what happened in the LA County jails, there was an abuse scandal, and the FBI did an undercover investigation, which turned into this whole like obstruction of justice thing, and got a bunch of people arrested and criminally convicted. And now Sheriff Baca was later charged with obstruction of justice and is now going to trial. And we even had one guy towards the bottom, and it was just so great. Niles Rose, he said something like, he was just complaining that after this jail scandal kind of went through, it was like, he's like, we used to be able to jack up inmates, and now we can't. Now they have all the power. Like, we don't have the tools we used to have. He was like reminiscing about the good old days when you could jack up an inmate for any reason. So this story on the data journalism side is just, it really comes down to, you can't do the story unless you build a database. We could have manually just kind of started a spreadsheet or even a Google Doc and done this. I think using, creating this kind of interactive web form made it a lot just stronger and easier to do. And the impact from the story, we had a couple other stories that ran with this, but they had a friends and family program where people got fast-tracked at the front of the line to get hired. And then within 2 weeks of the first story coming out in December of 2013, they admitted that they wrongly hired 80 people that should have never been hired out of that 280. And then we did the friends and family thing. We did a couple other stories. And then Baca retired in early 2014, like a year before he was up for re-election. And I think it was the jail abuse scandal, and then it was this hiring scandal. I think it was just like, by the time that this thing came out in late 2013, it was just like, there was just so much that it was just overwhelming, and just everyone had kind of lost trust in him. So he retired, and that was that's kind of that one. And I think I'm pretty much out of time. But any questions on the second story on the behind the badge, building your own database, and how that works? I mean, I'll say it's really important to talk a lot at the beginning when you build your own database, because you just want, like I said before, you really want, like, especially if multiple people are going to be touching it, you need consistency. And everybody, I mean, I've seen it, you see it a lot where people don't have those conversations at the beginning, and then you get 2 or 3 months down the road and you have this horrible Google Doc, say, that 20 people have been in, and it's all a huge mess, and everybody did it a little differently, and then you have to come through and clean it all up, and sometimes, and you have to be, you could do that, but sometimes you'll introduce your own errors because you don't know what those people were thinking. So it's good to have, to set rules and have everybody follow the same kind of script and same steps when they do their thing when they're building a database. Yes?
How long did it take to build the database?
How long did it take?
When were first stories
Sure.
published?
We spent most of that year. We were doing I will say this, we were doing other things, and we also built it and then fact-checked it twice, and then did a whole nother round when we did this interactive. So it could have taken half that time, but we just it was just a really sensitive thing that we really wanted to make sure we got right. Yes?
I have a couple of maybe questions.
Sure.
One, I haven't ever used
Uh-huh.
to see like what from like, and then how much data did you generate, like how many data points, and how did you analyze it?
I don't have access to it from here. I'd have to go through the VPN. But we had too many we had too many data points, I'll tell you that. I think we had 140 columns of data. So it's one of these things where like I was talking to Chris Keller at KPCC about this. Like I think
For
how many rows? We only had 400 and some rows. Yeah, we had 400 and some rows, but we had a lot of we had over 100. Why are you shaking your head?
I'm like, that's nothing.
That's nothing? Yeah, but I mean, we had 140 columns. I mean, it's just one of those things where when you go through this, you want to capture everything.
Yeah.
You don't want to go through 400 deputy files and then realize at the end, oh, I wish we would have written down this. So it kind of grew and was like, well, did they commit their crimes before they were in law enforcement or after? Well, that's a good point. So let's add that. Were they minors, or was it before they were 18? Because most of the 18 stuff we didn't count. So it kind of got really big, and then by the time we did our analysis, you ended up only looking at maybe 10 or 12 or 15 columns of information. If that makes sense.
How did you analyze it? Like what?
How did I analyze it? I just, I exported it to CSV. I mean, I think I like in MySQL, I used MySQL and I used Excel.
Okay.
Just because it wasn't, nothing about this, yeah, it's just a lot of counting. It's just a lot of counting of like how many people did this and how many people did that, like out of the total.
And you had so many columns and rows. I mean, this can't have been just this story. This had to be a series, right?
Yeah, I mean it was several stories. Yeah, it was like a half a dozen stories. We don't really do like multi-part series, with some exceptions, that much anymore. But yeah, so it was kind of just like this big story, and then a couple follows, and then the impact stories. But those are all good questions. But I think it is definitely better to like go big, and then you can whittle it down towards the end. You really don't want the other way around. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate your time and listening. These slides will be wherever the digital lab slides end up. So you'll have access to all this stuff if you want. And my contact info is right here. At the Twitter at Ben Poston. If you want to follow me, also on that page is a link to all my stories. So thanks a lot. Yeah. You want the slides? Yeah. So I can email them to you, or the digital lab. Yeah. Sure. Let me.
Can you just quickly tell what's going to happen in your data journalism class that you
Oh yeah, sure. Let me stop this for her.